thanks everybody for coming along today and listening to this talk, which is entitled, Should the Government Include Physical Activity Calorie Equivalent Labelling on Food and Drinks to Decrease Excessive Calorie Consumption? And that's effectively PACE labelling. And I appreciate that PACE labelling is somewhat controversial, so it's great that I get the opportunity today to come and talk a little bit about PACE and have some discussion with colleagues around the kind of implementation or the possible implementation of PACE. Just before I start, there's a couple of acknowledgements. So a lot of the work that I talk about today is funded by the Department of Health and Social Care via the NIHR, and we also receive funding from the ESRC to conduct research around PACE. So PACE is obviously around this notion of labelling food with the amount of physical activity required to expend the calories in food. And I'll just set out exactly what I'm going to cover in this talk. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about sort of general current food labelling in the United Kingdom. And then I'm going to talk about some pros and cons of PACE labelling. And then I'm going to set out some of the evidence around whether PACE labelling actually works. And then I'm going to talk about some of the evidence, some of the issues around that evidence and what we need to be concerned about before we kind of accept or not whether PACE is a good idea. And then I'm going to finish off by talking about some of the concerns that have been raised about PACE labelling. So I talked a second ago about PACE being a controversial topic. And I'd like to kind of talk a little bit around that, particularly in relation to eating disorders, which I'll talk about in quite some detail. The other thing to say is that this is a public lecture, so I'm going to present it as an accessible science lecture rather than a kind of academic lecture. Okay, so to begin with, what I've got here is just some examples of typical current labelling that we see on food when we go to the supermarket. And as we can see, we've got a variety of different types of approaches here, but effectively, traffic light labelling is the most commonly used type of food labelling that we'll see on packaged food. So if we just go to the top and look at the pizza, for example. So in the pizza, we've got red labels, we've got amber labels, and we've got some green. And so I guess I'm sort of suggesting that actually is quite difficult for the public to understand. You know, they have to make decisions about whether this pizza is a good pizza to eat or not. So we need to decide, is there enough green on this pizza for me to buy and eat this pizza? The other thing to think about with this type of label is that it tells me that half the pizza is 617 calories. So I have to work out what the calorie content or the energy content of this pizza would be. So we're asking quite a lot of the public in terms of mathematical equations that they have to work out on every food item when they go shopping. And I'm suggesting that that's a little bit unfair. Just giving people the information around calories isn't really helpful. There's no meaning or context to telling someone that half a pizza has 617 calories. So I'm kind of suggesting in relation to PACE or PACE labelling that actually that might help the public make a decision about whether or not they eat the pizza or not. So just to sort of follow on from that from that slide, one of the things that we decided to do was actually ask the public about current types of food labelling, and we focused on traffic light labelling. And so we commissioned Ipsos Mori to conduct a UK-wide survey of the public about their different views of different types of labelling. And one of the questions that we specifically asked in this survey was, do you look at traffic light labelling? And 32% said never, rarely, and 31% said sometimes. So we've got the majority of the sample who were representative of the United Kingdom across all four countries. And this is what they said. These are the main reasons why they didn't look at traffic light labelling. They're not sure what they should be looking at in terms of the label. They don't understand them, they're too complicated, and they never notice them. So that to me doesn't seem like a very good way of labelling food, when actually most people say that they don't really look at it most of the time. And so if we look at the grilled burger label on the left-hand side, I count there's actually 15 numbers on a single label. So when you go shopping and you have a traffic light, you've got 15 numbers that you have to work out in terms of what to do. So again, I'm kind of proposing that that's a lot. You know, if we're serious about helping the public make good decisions about what they eat and what they buy, we've really got to do better than this and really help the public in terms of making those decisions. So just again, to put things in broader context in terms of what's going on nationally. So the government have now mandated, it's not currently the law, but from April 2022, it will be law for all businesses with more than 250 employees in England, including cafes, restaurants and takeaways, to display calorie labels on food. And actually, the Americans are slightly ahead of us here in terms of the Affordable Care Act, which came into place in 2010, but wasn't actually really implemented until 2018. But in America, since 2018, retailers must display calories on prepared food. And actually, of interest here, there is some evidence coming out of America now that the Affordable Care Act that mandated that companies in America must display calorie labeling is actually encouraging companies to reformulate their foods. So reformulation can happen in two different ways. One is that we can make smaller portions, and secondly, we can change the content of food. So in the United States, many manufacturers of food are starting to think about reducing the amount of calories in food, I guess because they're concerned about people not buying their products because of the amount of calories that are in their products. So I think it's worth sort of remembering that there is a change afoot, and that will happen next year. So moving on to PACE labelling more specifically. So PACE labelling really is about converting the calorie content of food into the amount of physical activity required to expend those calories. And I thought I would share with you three of my favourite foods that I'm definitely going to treat myself to after this lecture tonight. So one is a nice vegetable samosa, second is a blueberry muffin, and then third is a nice latte. So in terms of what I need to do in terms of expending the calories in these particular foods, you can see on the screen what this equates to. So we've got almost 1,000 calories I'm going to eat after this talk tonight. And if I want to expend the calories, it's going to take me about an hour and a half of running and about 3 hours of walking. So I need to work out whether or not those calories are actually worth it in terms of the food that I choose. And actually, I might decide that I might just have the latte and the muffin and not eat the samosa. And that's effectively what PACE labelling is about. It's about nudging the public to think about whether certain foods are required in their day. So again, just to think about context, and I talked about at the start about weighing up the pros and cons and thinking more broadly about the advantages and disadvantages of PACE. I am open to the idea of PACE labelling, but I also appreciate that there may be some disadvantages or things that we need to think about in making an evidence-based decision about whether PACE is a good approach to take. So I'll quickly talk about some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages, and I'll pick up on some of the disadvantages a little bit later on. So if we focus on the advantages to begin with, we know that the public underestimate the number of calories in food. That's a fairly well-established fact. And so what PACE tries to do then is to put the calorie content of foods in context, to make that context easier for the public to understand whether they want to buy and eat that food. And it is the case that we need to be able to nudge the public into achieving energy balance. And PACE labelling is kind of bringing together two different behaviours, physical activity and also diet. And it is important that we think about, developing energy balance and thinking about making good decisions. Of course, there are many reasons why people are overweight or obese, but we do need to think about maintaining energy balance for good health. The other thing that we need to think about is that, a substantial number of the population aren't achieving enough physical activity, and we know that physical activity is really important for our health. So we've got to find strategies to try and get more of the population more active, and PACE might be one of those strategies that could be used to do that. I talked before about trying to persuade food companies to reformulate. I think one of the best outcomes we can get from PACE labelling is to really think about how we can get food companies to reformulate. We've seen what reformulation can do in terms of the beverage tax and getting companies to reduce sugar, and potentially PACE could be another way to persuade these companies that are producing high calorie, high sugar, high fat foods to reformulate. And then the other thing to think about is they're applicable worldwide. You don't need a PhD in mathematics to work out the energy content in food like that you might need for traffic light labelling. And we know from other evidence that the public find PACE labelling really useful and helpful in terms of helping them make decisions. And I'll come back to that in a second. So I think we've got some really good reasons why we might consider PACE labelling. But having said that, of course, we've got to think about the disadvantages as well and weigh up the pros and cons. So I get asked this question quite a bit. So, well, what activity type would we actually use on PACE labelling? Would we use walking? Would we use running? Would we use cycling? And so on. Everyone's got different preferences about which activity might work best for them. And I think, you know, to my mind, I think it has to be walking. Walking is an accessible activity, and it's something that most people can understand and most people are able to achieve. So for me, I think it has to be walking. We may find that the public ignore PACE. There's no guarantee that even if we were to implement PACE labelling that the public would even look at it. And I think maybe it would wear off over time. So that's again something that we need to consider over time. And also the question that I often get asked is, you know, do we need different types of PACE labels for different populations in terms of gender and age? It's not my belief that we need that, and I'll set out in a second a little bit more about why I think that that's the case. I think we can have a more broad PACE labelling concept. And then I guess the biggest concern really is about eating disorders and disordered eating, and the idea that PACE labelling could lead to an increase in this. I think this is a legitimate concern, and I think this is something that, you know, I have given a lot of thought to, and it is on my mind a lot. And again, I'll talk in more detail about this in its own right in a second. And then the other thing that people have raised with me is that, well, you know, not all calories are equal, and it is the case that you know, 100 calories of a banana is better for you than 100 calories of chocolate, and I entirely accept that may be a disadvantage of the approach to PACE labelling. So, but yeah, before I move on a little bit, I just wanted to sort of again set out a little bit about, you know, what PACE labelling is not, what it's not trying to achieve. Again, to try and maybe help the debate at the end of the lecture. So the aim of PACE isn't to try and persuade the public that they should expend everything that they consume. The purpose of PACE is to get us to just to think about the amount of activity and the amount of calories that we're consuming each day. So really PACE is about nudging small changes in our decisions around those behaviours, not for you to really think that you have to expend every single calorie that you consume. That's not its purpose. Secondly, it's definitely not suggested that PACE should replace existing labelling, but more to complement existing labelling. I've already talked about the fact that calorie labelling will be law from April, so potentially it could be added to the changes in implementation of calorie labelling. And then third, I accept that no labelling will be perfect for every person in every context, but obviously in public health, we're always trying to weigh up the pros and cons, where the balance of evidence might lay. And so I think that is certainly something that we need to think about. And I'm definitely not suggesting that PACE labelling will solve obesity, but I am suggesting that it might be one strategy that we can put in our toolbox to help us help the public to make good decisions about what they eat and buy. So what evidence do we have then that pace labelling is even a contender? So I'm just going to set out now some of the evidence around pace labelling that we have so far. So last year we published, myself and some colleagues published a review. So we summarised all the evidence worldwide from randomised studies to try and see broadly what the evidence might be around pace labelling, whether it helps people to reduce their selection and consumption of calories. And we found a lot of numbers there, but the key number is that in terms of the results, we found that when pace labelling is in place, the public tend to select around 65 calories less compared to when there's no labelling in place. And so if we sort of extrapolate that information into in terms of everyday decisions, so we've got around 65 calories. We all tend to eat around 3 meals a day, and that would equate to around 195 calorie reduction per day. But of course, most of us will eat more than 3 meals. Lots of us will eat snacks on top. So we could argue that's a relatively conservative extrapolation. But then if we move across the week, that's around 1,400 calories per week. And then overall, that would equate to around 1 kilogram per month in the population. So whilst 1 kilogram might, I guess, be considered relatively small, at a population level, 1 kilogram would be really important. If we all lost 1 kilogram in weight, that would make quite substantial input in terms of the prevalence of obesity in the population. So small changes are still really important for public health. So again, just following on in terms of evidence, Frances, who was one of my PhD students a few years ago, led this trial, and she was interested in trying to prevent weight gain at Christmas. I know it's a bit early to be thinking about Christmas, but we're going to think about Christmas for a couple of minutes here. So Christmas is a kind of a high risk time for gaining weight. And so we were interested in whether we can prevent the public from gaining weight over Christmas. And as part of our intervention, we gave the public pace information for festive foods. So you can see there some of the examples of the different foods that they were given. And then we obviously converted those calories into different types of activities for walking and running. And the intervention that got this pace information we prevented more weight in that group than those that didn't get the pace information. So there is some evidence in terms of some of the work that we've done that actually when you give people pace information in their everyday context, it does seem to impact on what they eat. And then Frances also followed this up by interviewing some of the participants that took part in the intervention that got this pace information, because we wanted to kind of understand what impact the pace information would have on participants. And so 3 key things that Frances found in this particular study. She found that the pace information was a key driver in encouraging self-regulation of eating. Participants talked about the fact that it did impact on how they approached what they ate and the amount that they ate. She also found that participants talked about the pace information really strongly resonated with them. They kind of really understood it. And also they were quite shocked at the amount of calories in many of the festive foods. They never kind of really quite understood the extent of the calories in foods, and that really resonated with them to think about what they were eating. I talked about the National Ipsos Mori survey at the start. So here's some more data from the same survey. So we're interested in asking the public about these 2 different approaches. So we've got traffic light and we've got pace. And so we said to them, you know, which one do you prefer? Which ones are easy to understand and so on. So you can see the questions there. And actually you can see that there's a 10% more participants actually preferred traffic light to pace, which was quite interesting to see. But if you look further down, you can see that actually substantially more found it easier to understand, more likely to catch attention, and more likely to help avoid high-calorie foods. So you can see there's a strong, not a preference, but I guess a strong indication that pace might be more useful for their health. So if you ask me whether or not I prefer apple crumble to fruit salad, I'm always going to say apple crumble. But actually, which one's better for my health? Of course, the fruit salad's better for my health than the apple crumble. And I guess there's a little bit of that going on here. I might prefer one thing, but actually the other thing is better for my health. And that's ultimately what we're interested in. We're interested in improving your health, even if it's not necessarily what you prefer. And then my PhD student, Natalia, developed an online survey where she did a similar sort of thing with children. And actually, I won't talk too much about this particular slide because it's Natalia's study, but I just wanted to highlight, you can see there a clear preference with children for PACE labelling in terms of what's easier for them to understand, what takes them less time to read, and also what catches their attention the most. I guess less so for the question around helping them make healthy food decisions. But nevertheless, I think, you know, it's clear here from children that they find PACE more useful than traffic light. And so again, I think whatever system we use for labeling of food, we've got to think about children. We've got to think about making it as easy as possible for children to make good healthy decisions if we want them to grow up as adults, being able to make good informed decisions about what they eat. So another question that I often get asked is, well, which locations and which types of food and drinks should we place food labelling? And I'm just going to again talk a little bit about some of the data that we've got in relation to the public preferences for these particular questions. So we asked the public again in the Oxford Murray survey, so nationally representative sample of the United Kingdom, and we asked them around food and we asked them around drinks. So if we just start with food to begin with, you can see a clear preference there from the public in relation to the types of foods. So chocolate and chocolate bars were at the top, and then cakes, pastries, ready meals, sweets, crisps, biscuits, all the things that we need the public to reduce their consumption of. But at the bottom, you can see fruit and vegetables, bread, potato, pasta, and so on. So one of the questions that I get asked quite a bit actually is this notion of, well, would I expect or would I like to see PACE labelling on every food, or are there certain types of foods that I think would be more useful? And clearly here, if we focus on the views of the public, there's a strong preference for those high energy dense foods. But it doesn't make sense to me to put PACE labelling on fruit and vegetables. And, you know, the public pretty much agree with that. But I think there's one caveat to that. And that caveat is, let's think about a scenario where you go into a coffee shop and you have to make a decision between buying a cake or a pastry or having some fruit. So if you don't label the fruit, you don't really have anything to compare your decision with in terms of buying the cake or the pastries. So it's kind of quite a hard comparison to make unless you have both labelled. So I think in those scenarios, we might consider labelling fruit and vegetables merely for the fact that it might help people to make the comparison and therefore choose the healthier option. And then if we think about drinks, as I guess we would expect, so we've got sugary, fizzy drinks, energy drinks, milkshake, and so on. I thought it was interesting that the public thought that alcohol should contain PACE labelling. I wasn't quite expecting that. I thought that would be less preferred, particularly given that it's more preferred than hot chocolate. So I guess that's something for us to think about. And then if we think about locations, so again, we asked the public about where would it be most useful for you? And again, you can see fast food at the top of the list: supermarkets, takeaway online menus, vending machines, and restaurants, and so on. Pubs quite low down though, so the public weren't keen on pubs and they weren't keen on restaurants and menus. And I guess part of that is that they don't want to have to potentially think about this information when they're going out and having a nice time. They want to go out, have a nice time, have a few drinks, have some nice food in a restaurant and enjoy themselves. And I completely get that. But the only problem with that is that most of the meals that we eat outside of the home are much higher in calories than the foods that we eat inside the home. And of course, we're eating out much more as a population than now than ever before. So actually, it's food that's consumed outside the home that's more of a concern than food potentially eaten inside the home. So for that reason, even though restaurants and menus are quite far down the list, it might be a particular area where we need to focus on. Okay, so just a little bit around issues with the evidence. Most of the evidence has been based on hypothetical eating scenarios rather than real life scenarios, and I accept that. Different types of pace messages have been tested, so miles and minutes, although we know that the public prefer pace expressed in minutes because they understand it more. Miles, not everyone really understands necessarily how far a mile actually is. We're also unclear about the longer term impact on consumption, and we're also we kind of need more evidence around whether or not pace actually increases physical activity, and that is certainly an area that we need to do more research in. Okay, so some of the concerns. So I'm going to talk about two of the main concerns that I get asked the most about. And the first one is eating disorders or disordered eating. And as I've already talked about, I think this is a legitimate concern. And as I've already mentioned, I think this is something that we need to consider in quite some detail. But I guess we have to think about the public health need and the wider population. And eating disorders are dwarfed by the number of people that are overweight in the population. So we've got 63% of the population are overweight, and we've got to think about their needs as well. And many of those people that are overweight are dying of diseases that could be prevented. And so I would like to argue that it's really important that we focus on all of those people that need our help too. That's not to say that eating disorders isn't a real and important concerns. And I think what we need to do is actually get more support for people who need support in terms of their eating and their relationship with food. But I don't think that means that we withhold an approach or an intervention that could benefit most of the population. I don't think it's either or. I think we can have both. Trials have also shown that school obesity prevention interventions do not increase the risk of eating disorder symptoms, and actually it's quite the reverse. So based on the evidence that we've currently got, it's not the case that obesity-wide prevention programs lead to an increase in eating disorder symptoms. I talked about the winter Weight Watch study, so the Christmas trial, a few slides back, and we also found no differences in uncontrolled eating or emotional eating between the trial groups. So the group that got the PACE information were no different to those that didn't. So again, no evidence that's the case. Admittedly, the winter Weight Watch trial didn't follow people over time, but based on the evidence that we've got today, it's not the case. And of course, in any public health intervention, we're always trying to weigh up the pros and cons, the risks and benefits for the greater good. And ultimately, we need to think about the wider society while making sure that people that may experience some harms have the support that they need to help them with their health. The other thing I get asked about is we need different pace for different body weights. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that now. So I guess I would sort of say that, pace labelling isn't an absolute science, but it's really a guide to help the public in terms of making decisions. And so if we think about the current guidance in terms of the amount of calories that we should eat, so 2,500 for men and 2,000 for women, it's an estimate to help the public make good decisions. And the same is true for pace. We're not going to have every type of body weight expressed on a packet. We might just have a range that we think might be useful in terms of a picture or pictures. And equally, pace is not meant to be tailored nutrition guidance. It's just there to give people an indication of where they're at in terms of different types of food. And actually, the variation by body weight is small. And I've got a calculation next that I'd like to share with you that expresses this difference as being relatively small. So if we think about a 10-minute run at a moderate pace, 6 miles per hour, I think that's moderate anyway. And we've got an 80 kilogram person and a 70 kilogram person running this 10 minutes. So the difference in the number of calories that would be expended would be around 17 between a higher and a lower weight person. And if we calculate that up to a typical 30 minutes of running, that's around 51 calories, which is about the number of calories in a small apple. So you can actually see the difference is relatively small, and actually a good way to compromise might be to have an upper and a lower limit in terms of pace labelling on food packaging. So just going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in terms of pace studies. We're really fortunate that we receive funding from the National Institute for Health Research and also from the ESRC to gain evidence to help us make a decision about whether pace labelling would be a good public health intervention to implement. And I think, it is the case that we need more real life studies, particularly in relation to supermarkets, restaurants, fast food outlets and vending machines. But I think we also need to think about, consistently measuring harms and benefits. So in all of our pace studies, that's exactly what we're doing. We're not just asking about the good things, we're also trying to assess and measure any negative impacts that pace might have on people's relationships with food. And then in terms of the studies that we've got ongoing at the moment, we're focusing on vending machines, talked about Natalia's work, focusing on young people who I think are a particular concern in relation to overweight and obesity. And also I have another PhD student called Alex, and Alex is looking at trying to see whether pace labelling can be implemented via social media channels. So back to the original question, and that was, should the government introduce pace labelling on foods and drinks to help the public make good decisions about their food and reduce their calorie consumption? I think the evidence is promising, and I guess we could talk about that in the question and answer at the end. I think the public think that it will reduce their calorie consumption, and we saw a clear indication from young people that it might be something that could help them to make good decisions, and they liked it. I talked about the systematic review that showed that based on the evidence from around the world, that pace may reduce the number of calories selected for consumption by the public. I presented the Christmas trial that showed that people who got pace information over the Christmas period gained less weight over Christmas than those that didn't. And I think reformulation is a really key thing in terms of what we would want. Whether pace labelling is implemented or not, we need manufacturers to think about what's going into their food, and luckily the beverage or the sugar tax is starting that conversation, and companies are starting to think about that. But I guess probably many companies won't want their products demonstrating that it's going to take you 2 hours of walking to burn off the energy in their food. So it really could encourage companies to think about what's in their foods in the same way that we're starting to see in the Affordable Care Act in the United States. And so I do feel that not pursuing pace could be a missed opportunity to really help the public think about what they're eating and what they're purchasing. And there may be additional benefits in terms of encouraging physical activity in the population. But again, I accept we need more evidence specifically around benefits specifically to do with promoting physical activity in the population. And so, yeah, that's it. I'm happy to take some questions. You can frequently see me on Twitter talking about all things related to public health, physical activity, diet, behaviour change, all those sorts of things. And our work also fits within the Centre for Lifestyle Medicine and Behaviour at Loughborough University, and you can find out much more about our work on our website as well. So that's it. And if I stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Amanda.
That's me.
That's great. Thank you very much, Amanda. That was really interesting. Good evening, everybody. My name is Esther. So I work with Amanda and Alison here at the NCSEM, and I'm just going to kind of facilitate a bit of a Q&A session for the next sort of 15, 20 minutes or so. So I'm sure plenty of people have got questions to ask Amanda after that talk. If you do want to ask a question, if you could raise your hand, and then I will come to you and ask you to unmute. The raise hand option is under the reactions setting at the bottom of your screen. For some people, if you're on a slightly older version of Zoom, you might find it under participants. For most people, it should be under reactions. So yeah, please raise a hand if you would like to ask a question. Right, Chris, would you like to go first?
Hi Amanda, that's great, thank you. Can I just ask, how useful do you think PACE labelling would be for children, younger children?
Sure. I think, based on what the children have told us, they would find it something that would be useful for them. And I guess, based on the current labelling that we've got, I mean, my daughter's 11 years old and she's just started secondary school, so she's making many more decisions about the food that she eats. There's no way that she could understand traffic light labelling or any types of the labels. So I do think it's up to us to put, if we're going to label food, we have to label food in a format that allows children to make decisions about what they eat. Whether they do it or not is another matter, but at least we've got to set them up to be able to do it and to make decisions. And I don't think current labelling really does that. And I think if we want to address overweight and obesity in young children, there are lots of ways to do that. But the first thing that we could do potentially is to make sure that we give them information in a format that they are mentally capable of being able to process. That would be my view, I think. So for that reason, I think we do have a responsibility to children to do that.
Great, thank you.
That's great, thank you very much. I've had one through from Julie as well, asking about the impact of PACE on people who simply can't go for a run or a walk or do that type of activity, but still need to watch their weight. Kind of what would you recommend or suggest in that for those sort of people, whether PACE would be helpful to them or not?
Yeah, so there are a few populations that PACE wouldn't work for, in the same way that it may not work for people in terms of the current types of labelling. So, for example, blind people won't be able to necessarily, they would need someone to interpret it for them. So people, for example, who are disabled may not be able to walk and run. And so for those populations, they may need help in other types of ways, for example, via the NHS Better Health or through other types of support systems. So really, we're talking about population-based interventions rather than individual types of interventions. And I think we do have to think about providing, weight management, lifestyle, health, behaviour change for all of the population. But I accept that this may not be the best approach for everybody, but it should be able to be accessible to most people.
So do you think there's a place for PACE labelling existing alongside the current food labelling systems that we have in place?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it will be law from April that calorie labelling will need to be in place. So it might be that a very simple logo of walking in terms of pace might go alongside the calorie, because pace is converting the information that's already there. Calorie labelling is already on many foods, just that it will be lawful in April. And so pace is just another way of expressing the same information. It's not a new approach, just a different way of expressing the same information.
Fantastic, thank you. Chris, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks very much for that great talk, Amanda. I just wanted to know what the extent is of the cross-cultural research with pace. So has this been looked at in different countries, and specifically with countries that haven't got as obesogenic an environment as we do in the UK?
Yeah, great question, Chris. So not that I know of. Most of the research has been done in countries that I guess we would consider to be kind of more westernized, probably because we're the countries that need to reduce our calorie consumption the most. That's probably the case, but in a lot of the work that we do, we have a broad range of ethnic mixes in our studies. So we would hope that the results that we get would be applicable to a wide range of people. So in the Christmas study, for example, it wasn't just it wasn't just British foods. We made sure that the pace information that was given was culturally appropriate. It was conducted in Birmingham, that has a high number of ethnic minorities. So we made sure that we had Indian sweets and all those sorts of things as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your question, Chris. Just another one, Amanda, around the affordability of food and how that can be a barrier to healthy eating. Do you think pace has got a place to play a part to play in affecting inequalities around barriers to healthy food?
Yeah, so I actually think if we think about inequalities and we think about the current type of approach, so I sort of suggested that there are 15 numbers on the current labelling that you have to decide. That's a lot. So that doesn't really address health inequalities or the variation in ethnicity in terms of understanding language. So actually pace is very simple. So we think actually because pace is simple and it's transferable around the world, it should make it easier for people or more groups of people to access that information. And of course, not every country uses calories. There are different units. Whereas physical activity would be a consistent and same unit, whether you're in America, whether you're in China, whether you're in Australia, which use a completely different system. So what we think, at least it would standardize it for all people across all nations throughout all countries of the world.
Thank you, that's really, really helpful. Alexandra Todd, have you got a question to ask?
Yeah, thanks so much, Amanda. Great talk. I just had a question about the concerns that you raised, for example, the eating disorders one, but specifically the one about different pace for different body weights. So I was just wondering where that concern came from. Is it from like a study, or is that like a concern raised by the public, or?
Yeah, so it's a concern that's been raised by people when I've presented work on pace, and it's also a concern that's been raised on Twitter a few times as well, as something that, pace wouldn't be a good idea because it doesn't address different types of body weight. But as I've mentioned, that's not its purpose. I mean, I think it could be possible to have a range of different body weights, but actually the difference is relatively small. So we might argue that we don't necessarily need to do that. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, so it's like from the public, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Amanda.
So we've got another person with their hand up. R. Whitworth, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, hello, Amanda. Thank you for that talk. It's very interesting. I was just wondering with children, have you thought about presenting it differently? So there's different kind of like images or things that would be more suitable for them, because some children can't envisage time and things like that?
Yeah, so we could do that. I mean, I definitely don't think miles or distance is a good thing for kids, but I guess we've kind of got to think about all of the population and trying to meet everyone's needs and cognitive abilities and so on. But it might be, for example, in school canteens that we don't use minutes or miles, and we think about a more accessible way for children to understand the information. So I think that's a good point, and I'll certainly give that some consideration. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Right, I don't think we've got anyone else with their hand up at the moment. So is there anybody else that has any questions that you'd like to put to Amanda following that talk? I think speak now, or we will maybe draw this to a close. But yeah, I don't think. Oh, hang on. Sorry, someone has just got in the nick of time and raised their hand. Suella, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, she's on mute.
Yeah, I've asked her to unmute.
Oh, there we go.
My impression is that women, at least, as they tend to be the provider of food for the family, will have a much more sophisticated idea of food values and calories than I feel you are giving them credit for. I don't want to be sexist, but I wonder if you have found a gender difference between knowledge on such things as calories or just simply healthy eating between boys and girls and men and women.
Oh, certainly in the Ipsos Mori survey, so the national survey that we did, there weren't, from memory, there weren't any substantial differences between the genders. And we also looked at it in relation to body weight, ethnicity, household income, educational achievement, and so on. And there was some small differences in population, but not anything to particularly to report. And I'm not sure about Natalia's work in young people. And Natalia's on this call, I think. I don't know if I've put Natalia right on the spot. Whether Natalia, could you help me out? Are you there? Is she there? Yeah, she's there. Sorry, Natalia, can you help me out?
Okay, yeah, so when I was talking to young people in my interviews, there didn't really seem to be a massive difference. I did find that a lot of the kind of the teenage boys I was talking to did seem quite confident in their knowledge of things like physical activity and food and things like that. But I wouldn't say there was a particularly massive difference there between genders.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I will revise my thinking.
Thanks for your question.
Cheers.
Nothing like throwing people, putting
I
people
know,
on the spot, is there?
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh,
That's
no,
okay.
not you at all. It's all Amanda's fault. Just one more that's just come through, Amanda. So are Arabic foods included in your studies at all?
Arabic foods weren't included. No, they weren't.
Very easy answer.
But there is it's not all just chips, and there's a broad range of foods that we always include. Tends to be more Asian, Chinese, Indian type foods, but yeah.
Okay. Right. So final call for anybody that would like to ask a question. If you could raise your hand now. There we go. Margaret, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering, there's a lot of people in the community that don't understand what a calorie is. So if we're wanting people to relate calories to physical activity expenditure, is there some way of educating them first? Because I work in the community, and often when I talk about calories, they'll say, oh, it confuses me. I'm not sure what they are. So I think to be successful, we first of all need to ensure that people understand what a calorie is.
Sure, I think that's a great point, Margaret. So thanks for that. Yeah, I think that is a problem in terms of people not understanding what a calorie is, and that obviously then, potentially leads to them underestimating calories. It's like a perpetual cycle. But I guess in context, that's a reason for PACE, isn't it? Because actually, if people don't understand calories, they should be able to understand what 10 minutes of walking or 10 minutes of running would be. So that negates necessarily the need to have a good understanding of calories. I'm going to put Natalia on the spot again here, because Natalia asked in her survey the 900 young children that were involved in her study about what a calorie was. And I seem to remember they had a reasonably good understanding. Natalia, can you help me out again? Come in, Natalia, come in.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
So it seemed in my questionnaire to teenagers that most young people actually did know what a calorie is. They did have that basic understanding of what it is. So I think
can I just say I was thinking more from an adult point of view, for people that are not in education, that perhaps they would then dismiss what you were trying to do because they just think it's too much. So people at school do probably have a better understanding, but people who have left school, say middle-aged, or not everyone obviously, but I do work in deprived communities, and often I get people ask me, I don't understand that, can you explain it? So I think if there was some form of simple messages that went alongside or prior to it going out, then people would know what to expect.
Sure. I mean, I guess it might be that when calorie labelling becomes the law in April next year, that actually there is more conversation, there is more awareness around calorie labelling. Of course, we have calories on lots of foods now, but I would hope that even if the public don't understand calories per se, that the PACE can put that calorie into context for them. So in terms of the deprived communities that you're talking about, I think most people will understand what 10 minutes of walking might be, or for them, or 30 minutes of walking might be, without the reliance and understanding the science of calories.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes, thank you.
Sure. Thanks for your question, though. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Margaret.
Thanks, Natalia.
Right, so we're coming up to 6:30. So if I don't think I can see any more hands raised, so I think that might be an appropriate time to wrap this public lecture up. But thank you very much for that talk, Amanda. That was really interesting. And thank you to everybody that's engaged and asked questions. We have been recording tonight's talk, so we will make that available online in the next couple of days, and you will receive an email when that's available to view, so you can watch again or share with any colleagues who maybe weren't able to be here tonight. But once again, thank you very much to Amanda. Thank you to everyone else. And hopefully you can join us for another one of our public lectures sometime soon.